that a civilized society is based on fundamentally duty and personal responsibility. And once you have that structure, which gives you a responsibility for creating the circumstances in which other people flourish, then you have what we have now thought of as rights. But if you detach that from duty, then you don't have rights, you have demands. That's what the rights are, they're demands. And then you have the whole unraveling in a society that basically falls apart because it is run on the basis of individual demands, struggles for power between groups, and an erosion of communal bonds and social solidarity. So, and once we all understood that, but for various reasons, and it's a story that I allude to in the book, because it's such a central thing in the West, the human rights culture, and it arose out of the finest and most noble of instincts after the Second World War, after the Holocaust, in order to protect people who were vulnerable because their own governments were persecuting them. And so the idea, was established that what you needed was international tribunals and international law. But the problem with that is that if you don't have law that is anchored in a sovereign nation, in a sovereign nation governed by the consent of the people, which produces those laws, if you have kind of free-floating laws which are not anchored in any nation, it becomes immediately politicized. It becomes open to political manipulation. That's exactly what we've got. So the United Nations, for example, the idea that the United Nations stands for peace and justice is a sick joke. Much of the United Nations, as we've seen in the last terrible 15 months, is hand in glove with Hamas in the Middle East. It's done very little against tyrants. Its Human Rights Council, elevates tyrannies and dictatorships because the majority of the world is not democratic. The majority of the world does not adhere to the kind of standards of morality and political organization that we in the West do. So if you have a transnational body like the United Nations, which is composed of, basically virtually every sovereign nation in the world, you're not going to have an organization that is committed to the brotherhood of man. You're going to have an organization in which the most powerful suppress the weak. And that's what we've got. So all that needs to be unpicked.
But who are some of those? And that was eye-opening reading in your book. I never really thought of the UN in that way. I'm a bit of a layperson with regards to these wider geopolitical issues. And so to read about, I hadn't considered it. I think most people hadn't or haven't. The UN, it's just this sort of neutral organization. Exactly. But of course, as you point out, Iran and countries like that have just as much say as anybody else.
Yes, and not just as much say, but they muscle their way to the front of the queue, as it were. And the United Nations is institutionally not just hostile to, but determined to basically disempower the state of Israel. Its Human Rights Council is a most extraordinary record. I've forgotten now the precise figures, but it's a kind of handful of resolutions for the whole of the world, and hundreds of resolutions condemning Israel. I mean, even if you think Israel is awful, the idea that Iran and North Korea and Russia and Syria and all the kleptocracies of the world are pale into insignificance beside the one democracy, and it's a human rights obsessed democracy, which is Israel. One democracy in the Middle East, which is Israel, is quite patently barking mad.
If you had somebody from the UN who was involved in that kind of decision making, what would you say to them? What do you think they might say?
Abolish yourself.
What would they say? What would their response? Their response wouldn't be yes, I will abolish myself. What would they say in defense of their absurd fixation on Israel?
I don't know what they would say about that specifically. I think they would sort of change the subject. They would say, but we're very concerned about human rights everywhere, and we're simply upholding human rights there. And then you would say to them, well, it's a disproportionate fixation, and they would. I don't know what they would say, but they would never have the argument. They would never. They would never have that discussion.
Yeah,
we would never get off the starting block.
It's absurd, and I know there'll be a percentage of people watching now who believe that Israel is awful, and I respect different opinions and things. But as you say, even if Israel is absolutely awful, it's absurd that it should have more resolutions than North Korea, Saudi Arabia, Iran, all of those countries together, multiplied by a huge factor. That's what it. So something's not right about the UN. I don't even know where to start with that. It's so frustrating, and I find it frustrating because people know that I'm Jewish. And I don't want to feel like I want them to think it's a fixation of mine or that I'm being biased. But I'd like to hear the other answer to that. I'd like to hear why that is. Something about it being Western, having different standards, I think, and that is, I think, part of the problem, isn't it?
Can I tell you a little anecdote which I've told millions of times before? So I apologise to your viewers if they've all heard it and they're going, oh, not this again. But to answer your question, an anecdote of when in 1982, when I was working for The Guardian, and I was a very different person then, and really wet behind the ears.
Lefty.
And what?
Big lefty.
Well, I thought I was a liberal, actually, but put that to one side.
Okay.
Anyway, I thought we're all marching under the same banner of justice and against abuses of power and betterment of humanity and conscience and all that kind of stuff. And I got very concerned. In 1982, Israel was in a really terrible war in Lebanon. It was completely stark. It was a controversial war by anyone's standards. But nevertheless, around the same time, President Assad, who is the father of the newly deposed President Assad, had caused to be killed between 10 and 40,000 of his political opponents over the course of, a couple of weeks. And I was very puzzled because this was, it was a news story on the foreign pages. It was quite a big news story, but it was just down the paper news story. Whereas, and nothing was said about it. Nobody cared about it. But every time Israel killed a few Palestinians in Lebanon, and they were killing them because they were trying to root out the Palestine Liberation Organization, which was a major source of terrorism for Israel, but it was planted itself in Lebanon. So every time they killed a few Palestinians, there was uproar in the paper in terms of what it was printing. It was a front page story, this is what Israel's done, it's so aggressive, it's out of control. And then a furious leader, an editorial, and then incandescent op-eds. And I thought, why is there a double standard? And so I was then an editorial writer, and I asked my colleagues in the leader room, in the editorial room, why do we appear to have a double standard? And there was immediately a terrible silence, and I realized I crossed a line.
Oh.
I didn't know what I crossed. I didn't know why I'd crossed it, but everyone kind of looked. And then they said, well, of course we have a double standard, because we assume that you, and I realized in that instant, I stopped being we. I thought I was part of them, but I stopped being we and I become you. We, like you, are brought up to believe in certain things: human rights, respect for every individual. The developing world isn't brought up like that. They're brought up just to not to know those things at all. And Syria is part of the developing world. So we can't judge them by our standards. That would be racism. And I said, what are you telling me? That if one's born and bred in Syria or the developing world, one does not have the same rights to life and liberty that we do in the West? To me, that's racism. And that was the point. And that is, I hear this the whole time. It is the suspension of judgment of the developing world on the basis that they're not brought up to respect human rights, so we can't expect them to adhere to them.
But Israel should know better.
But Israel should know better because we do you the great we do you the great honor of assuming that you are like us. And what's more, said my colleagues in that fateful exchange, you tell us you are more moral than us. And at that point, I realized that the people I thought were on my side were absolutely on the other side. They were deeply anti-Semitic, they were anti-Jew, but they were also racist, because they believed that the developing world was not capable of the kind of moral principles that we were. Now, to me, being human, part of being human is to make moral distinctions, to make moral judgments. They were assuming that the developing world cannot be expected to make moral judgments. I mean, they were treating them as less than human.
So bigotry of low expectations, or what's the expression?
Absolutely. Soft bigotry of low expectations. Yes, but it was even worse than that. Soft bigotry of low expectations.
But the hypocrisy here is that seems to be what is driving a lot of anti-Israel sentiment and a lot of anti-West sentiment in the press. At the same time, we're told that by them that there is no culture better or worse than another.
Right.
And that we should import hundreds of thousands of people from the cultures that are just as good as ours, even though we hold them to a different standard because of our soft bigotry of low expectations.
Right.
And it shouldn't have any effect or impact on our country.
Right.
This is bananas.
Well, yes, I think so. But I mean, this is the kind of iron wall one comes up against, because you can't get through that. You can't have the discussion about how stupid this is. Because why would it be stupid? They're people just like you and me.
They're in a cult. They're in a cult. Half the country's in a cult, it seems.
Well, it's not actually half the country. It's actually a minority, you see. But unfortunately, the minority hold absolute power. They run the entire culture. But, there are millions and millions of perfectly ordinary, decent people who really do get it. They may not think about it every day because they've got other things to think about. But they get it in their gut. They know they're living through a kind of madness. That's why they're all voting in the way that they're voting, for so-called populist politicians. Anybody who's not the establishment, which has led us down this terrible path.